Good afternoon. You guys had energy for Lynn, and now I'm getting, now the boring part starts. No. So I'm really excited to be here with you all to share with you some insights on this topic of people analytics. It's an area, actually I had a student just randomly knock on my door this morning, and it was an undergrad. He said, can I come to this thing this afternoon? And I explained, well, it costs money, but you can come if you want. And he was like, oh, no, forget it. But I'm really interested in people analytics. And how did you start? And he asked me how I started. And I was like, well, when I started, I was just doing data analytics. I didn't know I was doing people analytics until someone gave me that. I was like, oh, this is what we consider this. And so what I want to share with you all is kind of what I think that means. That title has started to become this thing that gets slapped on a lot of different things, and so I think it's part of my job as an academic to say, like, okay, let's break this down. What does this actually mean? And then talk a little bit about how you can use it in your organizations, its applicability. And so that's kind of my primary goals, cover it in general, talk about some examples that hopefully will resonate with you all, and then we'll have a Q&A where you can just sling arrows at me and I can tell you I don't know in a bunch of very educated, erudite ways, okay? All right, so Lynn kind of talked about this idea of intuition, and I think this is a really big kind of reason why analytics in general has started to become very popular. And in particular in the area of HR, I find that and I do this with my classes, I ask them, okay, if I asked you, how can we attract better talent in an organization? Or what makes teams go? What makes teams work? How can we increase diversity? What I find is people tend to have their own personal kind of lay theories about how these things work. People work for this. People are incentivized by this. Good organizations operate like this. And I say, this is good. This is interesting. We write them all down. Now I say, okay, what data do you have to show this relationship? How sure are you that this leads to that? And most of it is anecdotal. Well, one time when I worked, and it's like, okay, well, that's good, but I wouldn't go utilizing that as a policy, right? And partially this is because our intuition, what we believe is common sense, can sometimes lead us astray. And so it's a really interesting book by Duncan Watts talking about everything is obvious once you know the answer. And the key idea of this book is that our intuition, our common sense actually is jam-packed with biases that we don't see. And so this is what leads us to, say, well, I know how to run a successful company. And then if we ask you, okay, predict whether X company is going to be successful in the future, we're terrible at it, right? And so part of what Duncan Watts says, and he's a social scientist, and part of what I think the people analytics view tries to suggest to people is try not to trust your gut too much. Try to actually test a lot of these myths or a lot of these kind of rules of thumb in a way so that you can actually feel confident that X leads to Y, right? And so a lot of what I'm going to cover is about, I have a hunch, I have a theory, maybe this can be something that can help improve productivity or something. How do I go about testing it so that the decision I make is actually better informed? And this is not really novel in business. If you work in marketing or consumer insights, this happened in the 80s, right, with the advent of technology such as UPC codes and the like. Data analytics in sales and insights, I mean, is like way at the cutting edge. I mean, so much so that, you ever scrolling through the internet and you see an ad that seems to have read your mind, or maybe listened into a conversation you had earlier, and all of a sudden it's advertising something, and you're like, how did they know I wanted that, right? It's because the amount of data that is now being generated and the algorithms that are being created to help predict consumer purchases is just really kind of cutting edge. And if you just look at the industry for marketing analytics, it is immense. And you have people who are kind of working on experiences, on middleware, platforms, infrastructure. It's kind of exploded. It's a very crowded area. I think people analytics are starting to head in that direction, starting to get more and more people starting to realize, as companies are trying to do this, how can we get in this business, right? Some evidence of this, just look at how much people are actually Googling people analytics, right? Kind of a sharp or steady kind of growth. I feel like you see the sharp uptick. I think this was right when we announced Texas Presents session, and then boom. It's the Texas Presents bump, it happens. So why is this necessary? I find that the more I teach MBAs, the more I teach execs, they're like, this is great. This is very interesting. Who cares? Why is this important? And so one of the things I quickly realized is, while I am often talking to people who have some interest in HR, who do some sort of hiring XYZ, very rarely am I talking to the data scientists. Very rarely am I talking to the people who are actually running the regret, like me, like data nerds like me. Most often I'm talking to managers, leaders, executives of these organizations. And so what I tell them is, your understanding of how people analytics works, or an analytical mindset, is going to allow you to tune the most important tool I think you will need in managing, which is a male bovine fecal matter detector. Right? Being able to understand when someone is pitching an idea, when someone is trying to make an argument, whether or not that argument has any legs. What are you basing this on? Well, I think we should start to recruit more people from this area. Well, I think people who are underperforming, this is what we should do with them. You can say, okay, that's a good idea. My highly tuned bovine fecal matter detector says a bit of this is problematic because of the way you're sampling or the data that you're using or what have you. And so really thinking about things in this systematic way allows you to, I think, make some really smart decisions, or at least know what information to discard as you're making these decisions. Okay. All right, so let's think about people analytics and how it operates in organizations and where I think it's headed. Right, so the traditional view of HR versus general management, which I'll just say, line managers, people who are managing the primary business. There was mild overlap, might have been around perf evaluations, benefits, et cetera. The extent of that overlap will vary, but in general, it was kind of a little bit of an overlap there. More and more as the data started to get larger and larger, you start to see data scientists either being hired as a contractor or maybe a third party to help run numbers, create reports, get an understanding of benchmarking and the like. Okay? I think the first big leap was when the data scientists or the analytics nerds showed up and started working in HR departments. So raise your hand if you have a data nerd like me in your HR department that you're aware of. Are you that nerd? Awesome. All right. Hail to the nerds. Okay. All right. So, and this was really when the term people analytics came. There's articles about when the quants came for HR and the like. If this was where it kind of ended, though, it wouldn't really be interesting to me. I mean, this is fine, this is good, but this is really a narrow problem. What's exciting to me is this idea that companies are starting to realize that their people truly are their best asset. And so understanding the flow of people, how you can measure your human capital within your organization is as important as understanding your cash flow, as understanding capital flows and the like, right? And so when you actually have data scientists, HR professionals, and managers all kind of speaking and on the same page, is when you can really get that high level that we'll see. And I'll show you some organizations that I think are doing a really good job of this. To get this done, however, requires some skills tuning, right? So this is when I spend a lot of time in saying, okay, if you want to approach this, you can't just say, all right, now we're going to be an pro analytics organization. It requires kind of having a workforce that is data literate and experiment focused. And that experiment focused piece is something I'm going to return to, because I think that's kind of the big first step in trying to institute this kind of mindset in your organization. So Deloitte has a survey, and they look to see how advanced kind of most companies are in this space. And they have a good categorization system. As you see, 56% of the firms that they looked at use operational reporting. So they report what they have, they're good at it. That's where most people are. I think I sent out a survey to you all, and I found that a majority of folks here are also in this kind of range. We do some reporting, that's about it. We worry about data being accurate and that our reports are accurate. And that's kind of where it ends. Then you have kind of advanced reporting. So this is looking at any trends or benchmarks that you might be trying to hit, tracking how well you're doing compared to some benchmark, 30% there. And then you start to get to the upper echelon here, right? So advanced analytics, are you using statistical analysis to solve business problems, right? So are you actually incorporating data that these, outputs of these data nerds to help you decide whether to do X product or Y product, or what market should we enter into? And so advanced analytics is there, and then these predictive analytics, and this is kind of really out there, but thinking about forecasting models to understand, where things are headed and use that to actually do interventions. One of the kind of pieces that is here, and I was talking to someone at Deloitte Human Capital Group talking about these predictive models of turnover. So maybe you've heard of this, or maybe you have them. And if you put all your data in of turnover for the last 10, 15, 20 years, you can start to see certain things predict when people are about to leave. And you can start to institute these predictive models, and you can tell you who in your organization is most likely to leave your organization, right? And now what are you going to do about it? Do you intervene? Do you try to say, like, all right, let's try to bring them back into the fold? Do you cut them loose? All those kind of things. But to the extent that you have some companies that are using these predictive models to actually make decisions about people in an organization. And so you'll be somewhere on this list. Again, most people are towards the bottom. The really adventurous ones are towards the top. So I asked this question about, people analytics can be used in any one of these, and this is kind of my universal life cycle of HR, right? Everything from job analysis, recruiting, all the way through to turnover. And just from the survey, at least 4 or 5 people mentioned each one of these as something that they were thinking about using an analytics approach towards, right? So the universality of this approach, I think, is widely known. And I'm going to hit on some different aspects of this as we kind of go through. So let me give you a few examples, prominent examples, ones that you maybe heard of. Then I want to talk about how this can be instituted in a more narrow way for individual companies that maybe aren't these exemplars, and hopefully get into kind of some questions that you might have about how you might do this in your organization. All right, so some well-known examples. What's a company that you find, in your mind, they're at the top? They're some of the best at people analytics. Google. Great. All right. Google's kind of up there, right? And so they have a group, POPs, full of PhDs, and they are adamant about measuring, about running, using data to make decisions in a very, very kind of extreme way. And so I want to highlight 2 things in particular that Google has done. And this is all public information now. These are things that they share. So now they're in the process of sharing kind of their insights. So the first is Project Oxygen. So Project Oxygen was Google's attempt to figure out what makes a good manager. How can you tell a good manager is actually good? So how did they go about doing this? Tons of surveys of both managers and workers over long periods of time, and assessing performance of individuals and how certain types of managers and characteristics of those managers predicted that, right? Now, obviously, there's a big problem with trying to isolate what's a manager effect versus what's an employee effect, right? If you have employees doing really well, how do you know it's the manager that's actually the cause of that, right? How do you know the employees aren't making the manager, right? And so they use mobility. They use people who've left one or managers that move for various reasons, and then they look to see, all right, when that person moves, do people's performance increase or decrease? The new manager that came in, what happens to their performance? To isolate this manager effect, right? And so they found there's about 10 factors statistically that stand out as characteristics. Anyone want to guess what one of those characteristics might be? Adaptability? Maybe. Oh, no, I'm not. Now you're like, nope, not adaptability. I have my cheat sheet here. Being a good communicator is one, yep.
Data-driven?
Data-driven is another, surprise, surprise, yep. Clear vision strategy, technical skills to actually complete the job, right, was important. So there's a number of things, and there's nothing surprising. Maybe the fact that creating an inclusive environment, maybe that was something they didn't expect to see such a strong effect and driving a lot of performance. But all things that you kind of say like, oh, this kind of makes sense. But what's important is the things that weren't there, that you might have thought were there. And so what Google has done with this is now say, well, if we're going to institute training for our managers, let's hit upon the things that we know drive strong performance from your direct reports. And so it just allows them to make this decision that's a little smarter, right? You spend less time on things that really don't matter. All right, the second thing they did was once they perfected management, they moved on to teams. Project Aristotle, I love the titles of these projects. And this is about how to build a perfect team. So I did the same thing, looking at what makes teams strong, what makes teams weak, looking at the group level, right? And there, anyone want to guess what stood out as one of the biggest drivers of high-performing teams?
Management.
Diverse team? No, didn't pop out.
Management.
The leadership of it, leadership was important. Who said that? Trust, good, yes, so trust. So this idea of psychological safety, right, which is a combination of all these things, was really prominent, right? And so being able to feel as if you can bring your whole self to your job, you can make a mistake or say something that maybe someone else might question and not have it held against you moving on, right? That safety is important, and that really was a key driver. So now, when they have groups, one of the things they look to see is, to what extent does everyone in that group feel psychologically safe? Because they know that's tied to team performance, right? So again, it narrows the scope of things that they should be looking for, because they know, they're confident about what X predicts Y. All right, Oakland Athletics. If you've read Moneyball, you know the GM there took a very novel approach to analyzing player selection, looking at measures that hadn't been looked at before, and built a team that was amazing. They couldn't beat the Yankees, but they were good. Sorry, I'm a New Yorker. But they were really good, made a movie, and I mean, Brad Pitt played him in the movie. So if Brad Pitt is playing you in a movie, you've done really well for yourself, right? And so the Oakland A's have revolutionized the way that GMs look at baseball. So now you see this, even in other sports, to be the case. And then the final example I'll give is Ray Dalio at Bridgewater, and I think this is a great example of transparency and feedback kind of on speed. And so they've developed this app where everyone can give feedback to everyone else in real time, and you can see what your ratings are in real time. I hope to God they never institute this in the classroom, right, where I can see students are like good, and they're like, no, bad, 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 bad. You know, it's like thumbs up and thumbs down. It's intense. And so you end up with this scorecard that you can see how everyone feels about everyone else. He records every meeting, so they can always play it back and see who said what. And they use this to make decisions about how much should we weight what one person has to say versus another on a decision about an investment. And they use the feedback here to do that. Right? So these are all examples, I think, of these exemplars. What you might say, though, is, okay, well, wait a minute. It's a multi-billion-dollar tech company, a Major League Baseball team, and a hedge fund. These are pretty unique types of organizations with unique governance structures, oftentimes with someone that has almost absolute control of how everything runs. How feasible is this for my company? Anybody here from a baseball team? No? Okay, all right, good. So how feasible is it for me? And my response to that is, I think it's very useful. All of these companies started out with very small interventions, experiments. Will this work? Tested it, found out that it worked, and then expanded it, and then expanded. And now, 10, 15 years later, you see the dots, you see the scorecard, but that's not something they just implemented wholesale initially. So getting to operate like these exemplars, I think, requires taking that first step or testing the waters. And so having this experimental mindset, I think, is important. So what I want to talk about for a little while is, how do you experiment with people analytics? How do you avoid creating a monster? So experimentation is important. Why is it important? Social phenomenon is complex and messy. There are tons of confounds. You want to understand what predicts what. In most social phenomena, there's many, many things that predict a certain thing. And so being able to really isolate one and understand its impact is difficult. So how do you do this in a way that is actually rigorous? And so let's talk about one of the probably largest issues where we have this confound, this nature versus nurture debate. Right? So nature versus nurture debate, are we genealogically driven to be who we are, or is it a result of how we were raised? Did our parents hug us enough? All these kind of things, right? And so debate back and forth, nature versus nurture. And so part of what, when we've had studies that have been able to kind of give us some insight on this, it's been using the randomization and experimentation to try to get at this. All right. So one study that I found to be interesting, so it was a economist at Dartmouth, and he used the Holt Adoption Services Company. Anyone familiar with this company? So they do adoptions often in other countries with Americans that want to adopt, so Koreans that want to, Americans that want to adopt Korean babies and the like. And what's interesting about what Holt does is it's a queue, first come, first serve. So what you end up getting is a randomization of babies born with certain genetic kind of key markers that are randomly put into different types of households, poor, rich, white, black, single, double, whatever it might be. And so the economists use that randomization, right, because most times babies aren't given out at random at the hospital, right? You're given to your parents who you have a genetic link to. So how do you actually isolate that? You need randomization. So here's an example of randomization. So they looked at this data and they tried to see to what extent nurturing, so where you went, drove some outcomes. And so they found nurture has a very large effect on a few things. One in particular is drinking behavior. Drinking behavior is about 30% explained by where you grow up and not necessarily your genes, right, which I found interesting. But they also look like college advancement and one other one that I can't remember. Oh, whether or not you graduated or how long it took you to graduate, right? And so experimentation allows us to get into these really fraught kind of social phenomena and figure out which one is right. Is it this or that? You know, when I talk to organizations, oftentimes they're like, well, we're at a crossroads. We have to revamp this, but we don't know whether we should go this way or that way, right? Here's a way that you can kind of get at that, and that's with ripping, kids from their parents. No, getting at that is by using randomization, by using experimentation, okay? And in particular, I find that these experiments are particularly useful compared to the best alternative, which are best practices. Things that you read in textbooks, things often professors like me will tell you, like this is what the theory is on how to do selection. And best practices are fine, but they're vague, they're general, they're anecdotal, and they're correlational, right? If you really want some valuable insight that no one else has, you want to do an experiment. You want to test things out in your organization. That's going to give you precise, specific, causal, and robust insights. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. Okay. Actually, first I got to explain a little why experiments make sense. So a few things here. One, post hoc ergo propter hoc. What's that mean? Where are my Latin readers in the house? What does that mean? No one remembers statistics. After it, therefore because of it, right? We have a fallacy within anything that we look at is if something happens in a certain sequence, if B happens after A, we have a tendency to say, well, maybe B happened because of A, right? That's what a lot of best practices are driven upon. Well, you had a company that was very successful. Here is something that they instituted 5 years ago. Wow, that thing they instituted must be why they are successful. But to really drive at that, you'd need counterfactuals. You need to find companies that did that and failed, or companies that were successful that didn't do that thing, and then see if there's truly a relationship. That's what experiments do. They try to randomize, the predictors to see if every time they are always predicting the same thing. Right? Harness the power of random assignments, you get these clean, causal kind of relationships. Those are kind of some valuable things. What are some concerns about experiments that people have? What are concerns? When I say, let's experiment, what are some concerns that you have?
Observation changes the results.
Observations change the results, right? So the first thing is, this is, Lynn, if Lynn was, did she leave? All right. One reason why I really liked chemical engineering is chemicals don't care that you study them, right? If you write a paper about what chemicals do, they don't change their behavior. But if you write a report about what people do, that people change their behavior, right? So it's tricky, all right? That's one.
Takes a lot of time.
Can take a lot of time, all right?
Selection.
There's selection problems, right? How do you figure out who to experiment on? Sometimes the only people you can experiment on are people maybe you don't need. Maybe you're doing a lot of preaching to the choir, or you're experimenting on healthy people, and that might not be useful. Mm-hmm.
If it affects your hiring, you could potentially be accused of discriminatory hiring practices that you would have to substantiate the study that you
Yep.
used to base your...
Yeah. Are you going to cause harm to someone by a result of these experiments, right? So these are all really good. One, will people feel manipulated when they find out that you're running experiments on them? Is it ethical, right? Meaning, are you going to change something that happens in an organization? People are going to say, well, didn't receive the same thing that treatment group got because I'm the control group, but that treatment group is doing much better than me. That's unfair, right? And then the last one, are you going to create a monster, right? Are you going to actually institute something that creates an unforeseen kind of outcome? Right? So I can't guarantee you that none of these things will happen, but I can say for myself, having run a couple of these and talking to other folks, these things rarely happen if you run an experiment that is kind of well thought out and is small. Start small, right? And I'll give some examples of what that looks like in a second. All right, so first off, how do academics do this? So one type of experiment, they're natural experiments. These may not be as useful to you, but this is when you use an unforeseen exogenous shock to do this quasi-random kind of assignment. So what do I mean by this? Let's say you are interested in how people work together. So these working groups, people sit together, and you want to study the extent to which these networks might be driving certain performance. And then all of a sudden, your building has a major unforeseen structural problem, and you have to move to a new building. You're like, oh, well, in this new building, the structure's different. We're going to have to mix up these groups in a certain way. That's an unforeseen exogenous shock. You can take that opportunity to say, well, if we have some thoughts about different configurations that might work, and we know this is temporary, let's just make this change. Let's make a purposeful change to these groups and see if that impacts anything, right? And so sometimes companies will do this. Oftentimes companies don't utilize this, right? But these shocks can be useful. So within the research, things around like labor strikes that happen, sometimes you can see how firms adapt. There's kooky things that happen with laws. In Michigan, there was a reversal of non-compete law that was literally accidental. And so a researcher at MIT saw this opportunity to test, okay, what happens when this law gets banished about non-competes in Michigan compared to the rest of the country? Because now you have, Michigan was just like everyone else. Unforeseen, they no longer have non-competes. What happens to mobility in Michigan versus all these other states? And so you can use this exogenous shock as a way to find something out. And then something from my own research, an unexpected election result. You may have heard we've had an unexpected election result a few years ago. But in the midst of this, I was running a study with some colleagues at Wharton, and we were looking at political ideology of investors, about how political ideology might impact what they invest in. And one of the issues we had was, we don't know if the person invests like this because they are of this political ideology or, the cause was an issue. And so, unbeknownst to us, we collected half of our data before the election in 2016 and half of our data after 2016. And what we found is when you have a surprising national election, people start to really question their political ideology in ways that they didn't before, right? And so we could see differences in how liberals thought about investments before the surprise and after the surprise. Right? Conservatives before the surprise and after the surprise, to help us understand maybe made it more salient who I am. And so I doubled down on my investment strategies or not, right? So the great part about natural experiments is they're cool. The tough part is you can't predict them, literally by definition, and so it's hard to actually plan these, right? But a lot of our insights on these phenomena come from these kind of natural experiments. What you're probably going to look to do are these field experiments. These are purposely designed to test some kind of causality, utilizing random assignment within organizations and careful measurement of outcomes. So what does this look like? All right, so I'm going to cite some research here. I won't go into these statistic tables, but I will tell you kind of what the findings were. And these, I think, are some really great examples of how a company can use people analytics to answer a question. So there was a laundry service that was really interested in increasing motivation by giving out corporate awards. So who here has some type of corporate award within the organization, meaning if you exceed some threshold, you get a gift certificate, or you get an award, or you get a massage, or something to that effect? Anybody here? All right. They're fairly common. And the reason they're implemented is why? You'll be incentivized. You'll be motivated to get that award. Think about best employee or any of these things, being the top, whatever it might be. So this one organization was interested to see, they had an attendance issue with their workers, right? So people were showing up late. And if you show up late, that's time and productivity that's lost, right? They're behind. So they wanted to see if maybe if we give out an award, right? If you have really good attendance, they use perfect attendance, you'll be entered into this raffle to get a $75 gift card. Simple. I've seen this done in tons and tons of small businesses, right? This kind of award. So what the researchers were able to get them to do is like, this is a good idea. Why don't we do this only for 3 of the plants and have the other 3 continue the same? And they randomly pick the 3. And then we'll see, does it help productivity or not? Does it help attendance or not? Right? So here's something that they were looking to do. It's like, don't roll this out everywhere. Don't just pilot it at one, at your favorite plant. Let's randomly select where we're going to do this and see what happens. And so what did they see? Well, it improved attendance for employees that had previously poor attendance, right up until the point that they were late once and thus disqualified, and then they went right back to the regular kind of tardiness. Okay. Employees with poor attendance also game the system, often at cost to the firm, right? So this was, if you were late, you would be disqualified, and so if someone thought they were late, instead of coming in late, they would just say, I'm sick, and so you'd miss a full day. Right? This is how incentives go awry. People are like, man, yes, brutal. And then those that had been really good in attendance before decreased attendance and productivity, right? So the people who were doing it, who were on time just because they felt intrinsically motivated to do it, now that there was this award and everyone was trying to be on time, they felt like, well, this is a thing I was doing and you never rewarded me before, and now you're doing it and it's going to people who don't deserve it. And so just in the time that they were able to observe this, they saw that the award program created about a 1.4% decrease in daily productivity, which cost that company about $1,500. How much was that gift card? $75 gift card, right? Setting this thing up cost them $1,500. They stopped doing this, right? They no longer give this corporate awards. In fact, because I know the first author on this, he said, we were supposed to do it for like 8 months, and they saw this after 3 months. They were like, we're done, right? And so luckily they were still published a paper, but this was an example of an idea that they had, thought it was harmless, and then they saw the harm. But the only way they see that is they set up a field experiment to test what its real effect would be on productivity, right? And while you might say, oh, wow, man, you did that and you lost $1,500. It allowed them to say, we know what is a mistake, what we should not do, and we won't institute anything else like this again. And that wisdom can be more valuable than $1,500 often. Yes, question, comment.
Yeah, comment.
Question, comment, quament. Yes. Uh-huh.
It also depends what kind of incentive you're giving.
Yep.
So,
What if it was $1,000?
I don't know if you don't know your audience, so I don't know if it's monetary, I don't know if it's, extra day of vacation, I don't know.
Yeah, what's your reward? So maybe a different reward might have a different outcome. It's possible, right? So you could tinker with this a bit. They were not interested in tinkering. They were like, what? Okay, one more, and then I'll talk about some research that I'm doing. So this is research a colleague of mine here, Paul Green, is doing with some of his colleagues as well, looking at motivation for people doing really tough work. Paul seems to love people who do tough work and understanding how do you motivate people who are doing tough work. And so he and colleagues are doing research looking at tomato pickers. Tomato pickers on a farm, right? And so they're paid by the number that they get. They're out there. This is tough, tough, tough work, right? How can you motivate them? Aside from payment, their pay structure is pretty set. It's pay for performance, right? The number of tomatoes you pick multiplied by something, that's how much you get paid, right? How do you motivate them aside from money? Because at a certain point, you're just like, it is too high. I don't care how much you're paying. I'm not doing it, right? And so they were interested if it could be done by just some words of thanks or appreciation. Would this have an effect? Now you might say like, oh yeah, sure. If you say, oh, really good job, we appreciate what you do, that should have some effect. But they were smart enough to realize, well, doesn't it depend on who is saying thank you? Oh, yeah. So they set up an experiment where they had a randomized group look at a video, and it had an external beneficiary, a customer, someone that purchases the tomato sauce that this person picked, that's made from the tomatoes that this person picked, and say, thank you, I appreciate all that you do, et cetera, et cetera. Another group, randomized again, that got that from an internal beneficiary. So either someone that worked in the processing plant or someone that worked in the canning facility, saying, we really appreciate what you do. Thank you very much. And look to see which one had a bigger impact on productivity. So which one do you think had a bigger impact? External, customer. External beneficiary had a small but not statistically significant benefit, right, on productivity. The internal beneficiary group, so hearing from another employee how much they were valued, led to about a 7% increase in productivity. Just watching this video. And it lasted over a month, right, through these two groups, versus groups that got nothing, that just kind of went on their own, okay? And they asked why that might be, so they went in and kind of talked to folks, and they found that this desire to belong, to be accepted by other employees, seemed to be a motivator. A customer, they're paying for your product. Hearing thanks didn't seem to resonate. But hearing from someone else that was downstream saying, I really appreciate what you're doing, seemed to resonate much more. And as you can imagine, this is something now that they're trying to institute in a grander scale. And it's not expensive, right? So, the idea, one of the fears about experimentation is that it's expensive. Things like this, interventions like this, sometimes can be relatively inexpensive and can show, 7% increase in productivity. All right, so let me talk about an ongoing example that I'm doing. I don't have results to show you. I honestly don't even know what our results are going to be. But I'm excited about this project, so I want to share it with you guys. Okay, so it starts off with the question of wages and turnover. So I study a lot of people analytics. One of the biggest things people care about is turnover. How can we prevent turnover? How can we retain our top employees? Big, big question. I think even in the survey I gave you, there were more answers around turnover and retention than any others. And so to what extent do wages impact turnover? And so I'm working on this with a colleague at Georgetown, Chris Ryder. He's an economist, so he thinks about everything as wages and incentives. I'm much more of a sociologist, so that's an interesting relationship. But we're collaborating on this to try to get at this. And so one of the things that Chris is adamant about is that there's a trade-off, right, between how much you're willing to pay someone and the likelihood that they are going to leave. And whether you know it or not, you're always making that trade-off. So let's dive into that and see if we can design an experiment to get at this. Okay, so let me set it up just so you understand the question we're looking to answer. And we're thinking about it maybe in a way that most people don't. Very nerdy academic way. All right, so this is kind of a stylized model about thinking about productivity and turnover, right? Assuming that people leave after a certain time, you can get an average time or median time to turnover. Most employees come in, they don't know what the heck they're doing. They learn, they get really good, and then boom, they're gone, right? This is why we hate to lose because we've invested in this person, we've trained them, all these other things, right? So we lose all this stuff. So how might wages increase or decrease turnover was kind of the question. So we said, well, on one hand, if you pay people more, they stay longer, and so you get more productivity, right? Which is good, right? Because they stay longer. But on the other hand, if you pay more, you're going to get people who maybe are better employees, learn faster and the like, but then they also scale up and they might leave earlier, right? So again, you might not think of the trade-off, but you think of people, you could probably imagine an example in your head when you hired someone and you're like, this person's great. Man, we're gonna lose them, right? They're gonna be out of here, right? They're too good. They're too beautiful for this world, right? Like they are going to be gone. This is kind of a trade-off that you think about. Sometimes this is because you pay more, or you go into an area, you recruit from an area. Maybe it's a little more expensive to get into that pocket of people, or it took you longer to coax them, more time from the recruiter, right? So it's more expensive to kind of get them. So these B employees, more productive, but more expensive, right? And so the question you always have to ask you is this additional productivity I'm going to get worth the expense of getting them over a regular employee? Is it worth going after the stars if it takes more money or more time and all these other things? And so that's the setup. So we're like, okay, if that's the case, what would be great is if there was a way to get B to come to your organization without having to spend more money. And in fact, if we could use the fact that we've hired Bs in the past to advertise to recruit other Bs and kind of start this B train. Maybe there's a B thing in our title we need to think about. In any case, I do a lot of work with credit unions. So I'm a fellow for the Filene Institute, War for Talent. That's literally what it's called, War for Talent. And a lot of what I do is spend a lot of time working with these credit unions, which are in essence non-profit banks, on how to attract top talent, retain, et cetera. All the same issues you're all dealing with, they're dealing with, except they also feel as if they can't compete on salary. And so this is why this kind of a thing is really important. So our crazy idea is we looked at advertisements that we normally see for credit unions. This is literally taken from a credit union, not the one we're working with, but one that we just found online. And this is what an ad looked like. They say, come work for Numerica. Here are a lot of the benefits you have. It's tuition reimbursement, family day wellness program, all these other things, right? A lot of ads will list these, or they'll list the one benefit that they think is really good, whatever it might be. We said, what if instead we made an ad that said, want to come work for us? This is again to all the B employees I just talked about. People that used to work for us have left, but look where they've gone. Look at where our alumni have gone. One of them's a tech leader at Amazon. One's a president at another bank, director of talent acquisition, product manager, senior manager, right? Instead of decrying that we lost people, why don't we say, we've lost people, but they've gone to pretty cool places. Would that actually entice other B workers to come work for our company without having to spend a ton of time, X, Y, Z? Could this work? That's our idea, in a nutshell, right? And so the reason we think this might work, this is our hunch that we're trying to test, is the model of climbing the ladder is no longer a single ladder. People no longer look at a company as, oh, I'm going to work for this company, I'll be here for 10 years. Some don't even think they'll be there for 5 years. So why not be honest? You probably won't be here. We know you're going to go somewhere else, and we're fine with that. And in fact, being with us and spending time with us might help you get to wherever you're going next. Okay? You're not trying to kick them out, but you're saying if you're not going to be here for long, that's also fine. Okay? And so if that's the case, maybe turnover can actually enhance a firm's labor market position. All right, so it's a little counterintuitive. Again, we have no idea if this is going to work, but we convinced the credit union to do this with us. I hope they're not watching this. No, we're pretty confident this is going to work. It's going to work. Okay. So the way we thought to do this is by simply having those two ads that I showed you. So we created one ad that's normal, lists a few benefits, and another ad that highlights the exit options, what we're calling it, right? Places that other people have gone. Our former employees are at these places. They're not competitors. They're not places that you wouldn't want to have on here. They're places that are good, but outside of the industry, wherever it might be, right? And they do a lot of their advertising online, LinkedIn, other kind of portals. And so we randomize when a person clicks on you, which ad do they see? And then we look to see who clicks through to apply or who demonstrates interest. They have a way where you click, demonstrate interest, and then there's a follow-up, et cetera. The cool part about this is we're not really impacting hiring. We're not saying you need to hire based on this. Really, we're just looking for what types of people seem to be attracted to this type of ad versus attracted to another type of ad. Okay? And we combine this with a bunch of data that we have from them about who's done well within the company over the last 10, 15 years, what characteristics, background, demography, et cetera, seems to be highly correlated to success. And we have a rough estimate of, do people who have usually been successful in your firm like seeing one ad versus another ad, more likely to click and express interest? And if we can show that, that to us is at least the first step in saying this exit options advertising, there might be something there. And then maybe there's a secondary experiment we can do, right? So this is kind of a toe dipping in the water a bit. Whether or not this will work or not, we're not sure. We're in the process of actually running this now. Okay. All right. So if I haven't scared you, if you're still here, no one kind of fainted, so this is good. If you're interested in doing something like this for whatever question that you have, it doesn't have to necessarily be selection or retention or turnover. What is my advice to you? Okay, first is Best practices, fine. Develop your own best practices. Figure out what works well for you. Google's Project Oxygen, I don't know if Project Oxygen, if those things are applicable to other companies, because other companies aren't Google, but it works for them, right? So to the extent that you can start to develop your own best practices using experimentation is really going to be beneficial, right? Collaborate with academics. Shameless plug. The reason I say this, though, is we really care about getting the right answer and not necessarily the answer you want to hear, okay? We are incentivized, thankfully, to uncover truth, right? That's kind of my goal, tell you things are right or wrong. And not, and I've been a consultant, but if as a consultant, I'm going to be highly incentivized to get you an answer you want to hear so that you'll come back to me, right? And so collaborating with academics, plus we eat and breathe data, rigor, we eat and breathe experimentation, research design, all these things that you're going to need in order to run a really useful experiment. You want to have someone that understands how to do all these things, how to survey, what items should be in your survey, how to make sure you have statistical significance, all those kind of things. Don't wait until things get really bad to start experimenting. Start small, start with something that's easily measurable and the like, and again, have patience. Most experiments show no results. There's no effect. Does that mean you should stop experimenting? No. If I did that, I wouldn't have ever graduated, right? You have to keep trying, but different things. Okay? Maybe questions on this. Any immediate questions now? I'll take questions at the end, too. Okay. So let's tie this all in. I've been talking for long enough. Despite the big data things that you see all the time, big data is important. I think it's really valuable to have data that you understand and makes sense. Big data is, I think, a bit of a, I don't want to say a fool's errand, but chasing more and more data is not going to help you. But having rich data, having data that actually addresses questions that you're interested in is actually way more valuable. Okay? And I think this all starts with the question that you're asking and not the data that you can collect. Sometimes I talk to organizations and say, here's our data, what can we do with this data? And I was like, that's the wrong question to ask. I can just go in and find correlations and find things that are significant, but it's going to be nonsense. You should start with a question. What are you trying to solve? Right? And so it's a really interesting book by Warren Berger about a more beautiful question. And Berger's point in this is that the proper question will oftentimes lead you to better insights. So instead of asking what questions, ask why questions, ask what if questions, ask how questions. Right? How do employees evaluate a good manager? Right? Not whether you are a good manager, but how is it that employees see that you're a good manager? Right? This is kind of what drove Google's thing. The what if, our whole project looking at kind of these exit options about what if we did this? What might happen? Right? And we're going to find out some things that we never would have found out before if we didn't ask these really interesting questions. So, right? So think about the question you want to answer first. Okay? And so I'll give you an example then. Once you have the question, putting together an experiment or putting together or thinking about things analytically is fairly straightforward, right? So let's say you're really interested in how do we select highly performing employees, right? We know the high performing, we know what they look like. How can we be better at selecting people who are probably going to be high performing? Well, the first thing you need to think about is, okay, what's high performing mean? Okay, I teach people analytics class here for the full-time MBAs. I give them data that I've gotten from actual organizations. I scrub it and the like. And they had one case with data that had 2 performance variables, and they're trying to find predictors X, Y, Z, and so said, well, there's 2, and I looked to see if they're correlated, and they're not correlated. And I was like, yes. Sometimes you have 2 outcome variables, 2 performance variables, and they will not be correlated. So someone is very rarely good at both, right? That's important. It's important to have that discussion qualitatively. What do you think a good employee is? What do you think a good employee is? And then how do we actually measure that? Maybe if there's 2 different measures, that means there's 2 different types of good employee, and we should be evaluating people differently. In any case, right? So you do that. How do you measure it? How can you get this information? This is then how you say, what kind of data should we be collecting, right? We should be collecting sales data, retention data, client satisfaction data, whatever it might be. once you have the question, it becomes easy to figure out, okay, what data do we need, right? Now you have your independent variables, your predictors. What do you think predicts high-performing thing? What is some of your lay theories? What does academic research say? What does HBR say? What does your gut tell you? Though don't weight too heavily, right? What are those characteristics, attributes, skills, behaviors, whatever they might be? Okay, how do we measure these attributes and skills and behaviors? Oftentimes we don't. I go to some organizations that say, what do you look for? I say, well, we look for someone that's trustworthy and really passionate. And I was like, okay, well, do you have a passion scale? How do you know? Well, we just kind of, we gauge if they're passionate. We can kind of tell, I was like, okay, well, you can't run a regression on that, right? You can't run a regression on, I kind of got the sense you were passionate. But if you have a way to measure passion in some way, now all of a sudden you're in the game, right? So sometimes these steps just allow you to see, what is the data we're not collecting that we need to collect so we can even begin to kind of do these models, all right? So how do we measure it? And then what are some alternatives? So even if we collect this data, what else might be driving a high performing? Because the labor market, is it technological advancements that might have happened? Think about what the alternatives are. And then once you have this, you've collected data, that's when we start doing analysis. That's when the analytics part happens, right? So one obstacle that I think a lot of people have is, well, we don't have any data analytics people. We don't have any people who know how to do stats. And I was like, that's fine. But all the stuff we did just before, that can happen without a data analyst, right? Understanding how you define your dependent variable, performance, whatever it might be, how you define your independent variable or your predictor, how can you measure it, where can you get that data, then you can hire a data nerd like me to come in and run your regressions. And this is for selection, but this is for any HR function. You can do a similar kind of step through for anything you're trying to solve. All right, last few things here. Recognize where you are on the maturity scale is also important. Have reasonable expectations. This is from People Analytics Survey by Vissler, company that does a lot of things. Are you more manual, paper or spreadsheet based? I think I asked this question in my survey. Transaction report based, beyond these simple reports, and are you kind of on the high end, this transformational, where you believe these analytics you do are actually your secret sauce, right? Google believes this. I had two employees there talk to my class yesterday, my MBA class, and they said we spend a ton of time selecting people because we think selecting people and getting them prepared to be Google is really the key that drives it for us. That people are our best asset. They truly, truly believe that, and they execute on it. All right, this is my last slide, I believe. What are the three mindsets that I think you need to have or think about as you're trying to put this together? The first, the data scientist, right? Understanding insights from data. These are your data nerds like me. The psychologist, right? Chemicals don't care that you study them and that you write reports about them, but people do. Once you start to measure certain things, people start to pay attention to them. You have to understand the psychology of your employees so that you can understand whether an experiment is actually going to test what you're interested in, right? I had a class once where there's a woman who just adamant that it didn't matter differences in pay because whatever you negotiated for, you should be fine with. And if someone else got higher, that shouldn't bother you. You got what you negotiated for. She just couldn't understand that people aren't rational that way, that people are comparative, that people are like, yeah, I know I got this, and I thought it was a good deal, but then I started working, and this person's making $20,000 more than me. What the heck is happening? And now I'm demotivated, and I'm angry. She was like, no, that's not right. You got what you know. So don't be that person, right? People aren't automatons. You have to kind of recognize the psychologist. And the last piece, kind of tying it all together, is thinking how this stuff matters for what you're trying to do. Firms that are trying to grow, if you're trying to grow, trying to set up a new operation, have you thought about how are we going to staff this thing up in a way that either is similar to our other office? Do we want it to be different? How do we want it to be different? How are we going to measure the extent to which it's the same or different? All those kind of things, right? So recognizing, and I think this is when you get into the Shangri-La aspect of this is, are these insights on people actually going to help me achieve strategic goals, right? And bringing that in a real way, hopefully at the beginning when you're asking the questions, the what ifs, the hows, the whys. All right. Well, with that, I want to thank you for your time. I want to wish you good luck, and we're going to open up for questions. Yes, sir.
So one of these seems to be measuring the performance of the employees that
Uh-huh.
So how does all of this will help you in the hiring process?
On the hiring process. So what is the question? I mean, there's a lot of ways.
Hiring process meaning, when you select the right candidate for the job, based on the resume, based on the interviewing
Sure.
process. So how do all of these measurements assist me hiring the right candidate for the job?
So I think the first thing is you're trying to hire for something. You want, like, so that example I showed you was a selection model, right? It said, I want a high-performing employee, and then I want to look for attributes that I think are predictors of a high performing employee. So what are they? Are they high GMAT? Oh, sorry, GMAT. You can tell I'm in a business school. High GPA? Are they certain experience is important? Years of experience that they had before they started working for you? And so, a very simple thing you can do is just have you track that for the people working at your current firm and look to see these attributes that they had coming in, how well do they predict? Is the person still here? How well that person is performing? How often has that person been promoted and the like? Yeah. Yes, sir.
A lot of the examples you used were of really large companies. I think
Yep.
one challenge that we have at our firm is that we have 70 people nationwide and 4 offices, and so
70.
70.
Okay, good. I was like 7. Yeah. Okay, 70.
So I love the idea of experimentation, but how are there any tips for rolling it out at smaller firms where your sample size might not have the same size as some of these other firms?
So the short answer is you're always searching for variance in some way. So is there any kind of variance that you'd like to reduce? That could be performance, that could be, oftentimes it's selection. So even small companies will say, well, we get 150 applicants for this one position. How do we even go about kind of deciding this? Sometimes that's where your variance will be. Different types of people applying. You start to make selections. You start to see what their answers are. You hire someone, and then you see to what extent it seems to be, it helps to explain what you're looking at. But there is, to be fair, the less employees you have, the less variance you have, the less data you have, the harder it is to do. That doesn't mean that experiment might not work. Particularly, I mean, you can run an experiment on 2 groups sitting, like I talked about, the office changes. Do you have weekly data that you can collect on people, right? And so sometimes you'll find data in some interesting places. So you can look at network data to see how much people are interacting with other people. And that's something that you can measure every week, and now all of a sudden you have 52, you have 52 data points for 70 people. Now you're starting to get there. And that might help you understand who are the people that seem to be hubs of communication, who are the people that seem to be brokers between groups, and how can we understand who our brokers are within the organization, and maybe that's useful for rolling out some kind of change. You want to find the brokers. So things like that you can do. It really starts with the question you're trying to ask, right? What is the thing you're saying? Well, we want to be better at X. And then I can say, like, okay, if you want to be better at hiring, but you're only hiring 1 person a year, analytics is not going to help you. It's too few. But if you want to look at performance evaluations and you do them 4 times a year for all 7, now all of a sudden you're going to have some data that maybe you can work with. That make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I love the advice you gave about not waiting until things get really bad.
Yeah. Sounds like a bud is coming.
Well, I'm a proponent of proactive solutions.
Yeah.
I realize a lot of the time that's not an option and problems are already in place. But if this is something where you can't necessarily point to a problem like, oh, we have terrible attrition, how do you recommend getting buy-in to even approach these experiments? Let's say in a mid-sized company where you do have to work around organizational barriers.
Yeah. Well, if you have something that's going very bad, the good part is there's normally some kind of mandate for change. People are somewhat desperate to stave the bleeding, so to speak. That can sometimes be an opportunity to institute something brand new. What I find is most struggling companies move to something, right? So say, like, look, if we're going to move to this, why don't we move to it in a smart, structured way if we're going to make a change? What you're going to get, though, is probably less cooperation from certain people that feel ostracized or they've lost trust in the organization, what have you. But you don't really have a choice at that point if you're not being proactive. So you can still do it. It's just if you can see it's getting bad, try to get ahead of it. But if you're in a situation that's already bad, that company's going to do something. What you're just trying to say is like, let's do something smart, and let's do it in a kind of evidence-based driven way instead of just you read something on an HBR now. Oh, we should do full transparency. Everyone now is going to know what everyone else makes, and don't do it that way. And sometimes even doing that will help prevent making a bad mistake. Yes, sir.
You mentioned proactive.
Yeah.
And, this is the opposite. This concerns the state of Texas. And around Austin, there's a lot of talk about coming silver tsunami. In the next 4 or 5 years, most of the senior leadership of state agencies and commissions are expected to retire.
Yeah.
And the leadership, particularly the elected leadership of the state, apparently is not doing anything proactively to address that. What would you suggest they do if they chose to be proactive about it?
So this is about like succession planning or filling the pipeline for leadership.
And
Well-
I assume that you've heard this problem.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Within the credit union is also the same. I think most industries are having this issue as well. So I would unpack that problem a bit. It sounds like a combination of you're either not bringing in people who want to be leaders, or you're losing those leaders before they get to kind of the secondary level, right? So is the focus on, first thing I would want to figure out is when are people jumping ship? Are they in for 3 years and then they're out? Are they staying for 10 years, getting to middle management, then getting frustrated and then getting out? Like, so where is the pressure point? Where's the pain point in this? Right? If you don't have anyone right beneath you, there's 2 or 3 reasons why that might be the case. Once you figure that out, then it becomes a more manageable problem. Is it middle managers, they get to a certain point and then they feel as if, oh, man, I have to wait for someone to die in order to get the next level. So it's true, thank you. Yeah, I'm not saying anything that hasn't been said to me. Right, then it's, all right, do we need to focus on a certain level of managers that have been here for 7 to 10 years that we think are good? What can we do to show them there's opportunities, whether it's giving them stretch assignments earlier, what aspect of their kind of career development can we alter? If that's the case. If it's that we're just not even getting, people are in for 5 years and out, we're not even getting people to that 10-year piece, then you have an issue of when we're recruiting people, the expectations that they have do not match the expectations that we have. And so then it might be much more of a how are you attracting and recruiting people? Where you're recruiting them, what backgrounds are you recruiting on that maybe there's opportunities to recruit people that are elsewhere. There are some nonprofits that kind of a staunch belief, like in credit unions that I work with, we want people who care even if they don't know how to do the job. Because I can teach them how to do the job, I can't teach them how to care, right? And they found if we have people that care, they tend to stay longer, all those other things. I've asked them to measure this. They're like, well, we don't know how to. They measure it the same way I said. So I was like, you need some measure of commitment or something to that effect. So I know that it's not a great answer. It's also not a magic bullet. But the first step for me would be the problem you have, figure out where that pain point is, where you're losing people. And then say like, okay, we're losing people here. Now it's a middle management retention issue. Is it a recruiting issue? Is it that we need to start recruiting more people at that middle level? And we don't know where to find people that are experienced hires because they'll be our future leaders.
Salary gap issue.
Could be a salary gap issue, though. That means that there's some evidence that people are leaving, and as they're leaving, they're like, I love it here, everything here is great, but I can make more money somewhere else. And if you go through the exit data and that's it, then you're like, we need to find out a way to close that gap. My guess is it's money and something else. And so oftentimes addressing the other thing can at least stave off some of the bleeding. But that would be the first step. And we could talk more afterwards. Yes, sir.
I'm curious in your research if you've had a chance to visit with Southwest, because their fundamental hiring philosophy is to hire for attitude.
Yeah.
Train them to do their work, and I'm curious if you had a chance to visit with them to see what their first year attrition is, et cetera, and compare that to industry norms.
Yeah, I have not had an opportunity to visit Southwest. We've had people in our exec ed from Southwest. We have the Herb Keller Entrepreneurship Center here, so I've met Herb and talked to him and all those kind of things. So I probably need to get up there and visit them. But the model, I teach Southwest case, it's definitely one that's valuable. I'm not sure about their attrition rates, but one of the things that I think they pride themselves on are we're really good at finding people who are a good fit here, they stay, and that they're happy. And people who are not a good fit realize that pretty early on, and so then they leave. And so what you get is this very rich culture. Right, yeah. And to be honest, the same thing works in the hardest investment bank, right? With a very different culture. The people there are people who know very early on, like, I know what this thing is about. If this is not for me, I'm out quickly. No one does 5 years in investment banking and then be like, you know what? Maybe this isn't for me. Like they kind of know pretty early on.
So, where does AI, artificial intelligence, fit into all of this? Because there's talk about correlation and talk about the future and talking about just analyzing the data sets you already have
Yep.
so that you can get a better feel for the things that are important. I mean,
Yep.
it may not be that you need to start by doing a survey and gathering data. You've already got this. So tell us about AI.
Yeah. So this is also a kind of a new area, AI, machine learning, using kind of black box algorithms to make predictions. This is like on the predictive side of things, so the far end of the scale. It is a lot of stops and starts. And the reason is any algorithm, any kind of an AI is in essence a very complex algorithm. There are a number of reasons why you maybe don't want AI making people decisions. In fact, Google has explicitly said we want people making people decisions. And the reason is algorithms are literally literal, right? So they will only do what you ask them to do. They're myopic. They only care about what the inputs are. So there might be other inputs that you've assumed, we want high-performing people, but we don't want a bunch of jerks. The algorithm is not going to select for jerks. It's just selecting, and so it's myopic. It's very narrow. If the data that it's utilizing to make predictions is biased, then the prediction you're going to get are going to be biased. So there's algorithms now, for example, policing. And a big problem with this is that they're using previous data on arrests to predict future likelihood of arrests. But what do you know about previous data on arrests is that they were biased, right? Certain people get arrested more, put in jail more, and so you're perpetuating certain biases. And so if you're going to utilize kind of a black box, a thing that's going to tie this to this and tell you and give you predictions that you're going to trust, you have to be really sure that your data is good. And you have to have someone that's at least at the till to make sure things don't, you don't get every bad sci-fi novel is, we trusted in the machine and we had Asimov's 3 rules and, the machines are going to kill us, right? That you don't end up with a monster, with a machine that's going to end up destroying your company. So I think people are starting to figure that out, but there's a lot of hesitation because these are black boxes that are making decisions and you don't know how they're making the decisions. And so how comfortable are you in saying you're hired, you're promoted based on a black line? It's like, well, why did I get promoted? Well, our algorithm said you should be promoted. And our algorithm is right. And they're like, well, is that satisfying?
So is there anybody that stands out as kind of leader of the pack in making progress in this area?
I don't know any organization. So here the other thing is, a lot of the organizations that are doing this are not talking about it. They are trying it out, seeing how it works. I know for sure Google has done a ton of machine learning stuff to use algorithms to predict things like who's going to perform well here, and they backed away from utilizing it. My guess is they probably have all this stuff somewhere, but they're not using it in ways that we think. But they're probably, no one organization stands out. There's a lot of researchers who are studying this. At MIT, there's a couple of folks who are looking at AI. There's a guy in Berkeley. Researchers I know. Companies, not so much. I have a feeling there's more using them than we know. Yeah.
One more question.
Gail, I didn't realize you were going to be my most ardent question asker.
Okay, but with automation and online and we get, any organization gets a lot of online applications. You're overwhelmed, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get 300-400, you've got one position to fill. How do you manage that data? Is there any way to make it better, make it easier to digest so that you make a better decision? Because just looking through resumes is just overwhelming. And you just
Yeah.
kind of like,
Is that what you do for hiring? Okay.
It's overwhelming, it's too much.
I agree. So there are programs you can do where you can scan things and have kind of programs that scan for certain words and then ping, or provide a score for certain resumes. And there are, LinkedIn. What's the other one that's competing with LinkedIn? Indeed. They have these technologies that, and this is kind of the service they provide, is allowed to match what you're looking for with what things are going for. So that's a way to be more efficient. The issue, not the issue, it depends. If you're looking to hire for a position where you think there's a lot of people who could potentially be a good fit, then using that model is fine. But if you're looking to hire a VP or someone that you're like, this person needs a very specific set of skills, this is not the ideal way to do it, because those things are going to drop out outliers. And sometimes those outliers are the perfect person for the job, but there's someone with a non-traditional background or something to that effect. So I would use it if I had to fill in a place that maybe had a lot of turnover or was a general kind of skill set. I could very easily pick out who should or shouldn't be good at this. The more specific or selective the skills that you need for it, I would trend away from this a bit. I was just going to mention one other thing, which was, there's no way to anticipate gaming. So this is the issue with the algorithm is, once people know, the algorithm is picking up on certain words, what's going to happen? People are going to start to only write their resumes with those words, and all of a sudden the algorithm is no longer predictive. Right? And so this is the game you play. And so you always then have to be updating the algorithm so that you can stay one step ahead of people trying to game the system. And at a certain point you got to say, like, do we want to do this cat and mouse thing, or is there a better way? But that's one way that I think it's used. So matching, those kind of things are being used right now to help you. All right, here are 30 people who you think are the best match, and then you go through those 30. Yes, sir.
Much work in tying some of that into like personality assessments like that. We've successfully used predictive index in trying to figure this out. We would open up a position, I'm from Portland, we'd open a position, we get 300 resumes, and it's like, holy cow, so we start using the predictive index, at least to get it down to 10 or 20.
Yes. And so again, if this is, like your head of HR or something like that, I would be a little worried. I'd at least want to scan through those 300 to make sure, but if it's for a lower manager position, then yes, right? So there's always a trade-off in time and efficiency. But I always get a little nervous with matching algorithms because I've written matching algorithms and they are fuzzy logic. They are best bets. And if they work for you, great. But if you find, we're like 50-50, then it means something's going on there and you might want to actually start to develop your own, right? Yeah.
What's the timeline for your research on wages versus turnover?
Oh, man.
At least a soft
We're just here having a good conversation. You start throwing deadlines at me. So we are, I would say by fall, by September, I should have some results. For sure, the people at the center would like for me to have results by September. And so that's the goal. So as soon as I can finish teaching, which is killing me. No, as soon as my main job ends in the teaching side, then in May, it'll ramp up a bunch. And I'll probably have to go out there. It's in I can't say where it is. But it's somewhere not here. So I got to go there and be on site. But by August and September. And trust me, if we find cool stuff, we will be sending all of you guys emails about this, because then I'll be interested in seeing how it might work in other contexts and the like. Yes.
I would say I could also ask you afterward, but from, I guess, the employee perspective, I had recently got a call from something I applied for, and they were basically like, oh, you basically got this internship, and they were like, hey, we actually changed the score for our predictive index, and now you're down by 2, and it ended up being the director of HR, because that's who I had met at this case competition I was at. He's like, and I have to apologize to you because I went to the highest up, and we're no longer able to hire you. And so I was like, okay, because all that means that I could do well somewhere else also, but then at what point do companies begin to consider those people who they thought would be like a great asset, but they didn't hire because it was a constraint or it was going against their indexes or their data?
Yeah, well, first off, I'm sorry. That's brutal. Sorry, actually, you don't have that job. I'm like, what? And those things are going to happen occasionally. Here is the thing that I think about a lot, and the only people who are tracking this are the aggregators, are the LinkedIns and the Indeeds, which are, they'll give you matches, you'll select one, which means you don't select a ton of people. What happens to those other people? Like, what's the counterfactual? So the people that you didn't hire, how well did they end up doing? That's really what you want to know, right? It's good to know, did I select someone that they did do well? But was there someone who I was thinking about but didn't select and they ended up doing really well? And what did I miss? And most companies do not track all the people that applied but that didn't get the job. Where did they end up going? Stay in contact with them. It's just an arduous task. But you know who is? LinkedIn is capturing that. Indeed is capturing that. And so I think they probably understand that and will likely one day be willing to sell it to companies for a nice price, if they aren't already, right? Being able to tell you, okay, here's who you selected, who are your finalists, and then it can tell you, like, all right, well, the people who were your finalists that you didn't select, here's all the places they are now, or here's where they are in their respective organizations, and they'll probably have that insight. So that's where it's all going, and I think, so get a job at Indeed.
Thank you so much, Sekou.
Thank you all, it's been great. Coming up.